Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of season 2 of Christian Emotional Recovery, the podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Leroy, and in this episode, episode 10, we will be talking about Erikson's stages of development and adverse childhood experiences. Erikson's stages of development and adverse childhood experiences. Now, that sounds like a mouthful, so you may be wondering, what's this episode about? Well, last time we talked about narcissistic abuse, and we had a series on narcissistic abuse that covered 4 episodes, and now we're off of that series, and we're back to our regular podcast. And Erikson's stages of development and adverse childhood experiences is also a YouTube video. I did want to be transparent. And so if you haven't, please click the link below that is the YouTube channel, Christian Emotional Recovery, and subscribe by clicking on the bell in the channel for exclusive content that's different than the podcast. I am trying to put out a YouTube video about every 2 weeks. I may not always be able to, but I'm trying to as often as I can. And usually that's a little bit more specialized, concentrated, and shorter topics. So you're going to get exclusive content there you're not going to get at the podcast itself. So check out that link, click on the bell, subscribe to the YouTube videos, and you'll get even more content to help you heal trauma, narcissistic abuse, childhood emotional neglect, other forms of trauma, and emotional issues. So go ahead and click on that and subscribe. And that's one reason that I wanted to use a YouTube video as the podcast for this week, partly to promote it, but also it does take a lot of time to do both a podcast and a YouTube channel, so this is sort of to save me some time, but also so you can get access to what you're missing out on in the YouTube channel. So go ahead and subscribe if you haven't. Also, check out the Christian Emotional Recovery Facebook group if you haven't been able to do that, and also go to ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com for other things that you can see on the website as well. And I'll let you know, but right now the Patreon channel is on hold, but I will hope to come back to it and get it started and going again really soon. But let's go ahead and talk about Erikson's stages of development and adverse childhood experiences. So in this episode, like I said, adverse childhood experiences is also called ACEs. That's ACES or ACE. So if you see that acronym, that's what it means. And it can impact our development as children. If we survive narcissistic abuse, childhood trauma, childhood emotional neglect, and other forms of abuse or adverse childhood experiences at a specific time in our development, we often get stuck there. And the trauma that impacts our lives will make our reactions to triggering situations similar to that as our reactions at that age. In other words, our social and emotional development becomes stuck and we repeat patterns from childhood. That probably does sound familiar. And so that's how this is why I'm talking about this topic, and that's the connection between adverse childhood experiences and Erickson's stages of development. So by understanding Erickson's stages of development and how adverse childhood experiences that occurred during these specific stages impacted us, we can begin to take inventory on our own emotional and social development, where and when trauma may have kept us stuck, and start doing healing work around the age periods through journaling, meditation, and inner child work to help us release that trauma and develop emotionally and socially into the healthy adults God made us to be by healing trauma at its true source. So that's what this episode will be about today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of Christian Emotional Recovery, the YouTube channel. And I am Rachel Leroy. And in this episode, I wanted to talk about Erickson's stages of development and adverse childhood experiences. And you might be wondering, what the heck is that? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. But basically, Erickson's stages of development are the stages of development that all humans go through. It's pretty established in the psychological community but what we go through from the time we're born to the time we die, and the regular stages of healthy development, and what happens when a lot of people suffer from narcissistic abuse, adverse childhood experiences, childhood emotional abuse or neglect, or other forms of abuse, is that development gets arrested and it gets stuck in a certain stage. And that's why when you feel scared or when you react a certain way, that's why inner child work can be so helpful. And that's why if you see a therapist, IFS or internal family systems is a great type of therapy to help you work through that and into the later stages of psychological development so that you can live the life that God meant for you to live. So I'm going to come back and talk about what are some of these terms, what do they mean, how do they impact me, how do they impact you, and so I wanted to talk about first Erickson's stages of development. And the human has a specific set of steps that they need to go through psychologically, emotionally, mentally, and physically in order to fully develop into the healthy, functional adult that can contribute to society. And if that doesn't happen, what happens a lot of times is that gets, like I said, somebody gets stuck in one of those stages because they don't push through because of something that happened to them or a series of things that happened to them when they were a child, and that's not their fault. That's not your fault. But I want you to be aware of it so you can know how doing this healing work can help you push through those stages, even if you had an adverse childhood. And these are based on specific psychological terms and specific psychologically established steps. So we're going to talk about those in just a minute. If you like what you see and like what you hear, if this is helpful information, then click subscribe. Click the subscribe bell on the YouTube channel. Also, subscribe to the podcast. Subscribe to the Christian Emotional Recovery Facebook page. And you can also see how you can support me on Patreon because, like I said, I take a lot of time out to do these videos and to do the podcast. I also have health issues and I'm working, paying bills just like you are. So this helps me to be able to take the time out, and it helps me to put money back into the podcast because there are resources that I use that I pay for to help me to be able to do this. So if you can support in any way, I greatly appreciate it. And you can see that in the show notes, and you'll see the resources from this video based on the articles that I'm using as well. So I will look at the screen over here. My computer's right here. So if you see me looking over here, that's because I'm looking at my notes and I'm looking at these articles so I can give you the information that will help you today. So let's talk about Erickson's stages of development. Erik Erikson is a psychologist who did work in the 20th century, and he came up with stages of psychological development after a lot of iterative studying, and this has been refined over time by other therapists and other specialists, and this is a very widely accepted model in the psychological community in terms of how we develop when we're children. And why does this matter? Why does this matter to you and me? Because when you grow up, if you were suffered from childhood emotional neglect, you didn't get what you needed, if you had a narcissistic parent, if you had a parent who was an alcoholic or had a drug problem, if you were in a situation where somebody in the family abused you or tormented you emotionally, or you were just didn't get what you needed, maybe chronically. It could be maybe you were sexually abused, maybe you were physically abused, maybe you were psychologically abused. Whatever the case may be, if something like that happened to you on a high level, on a chronic level, and it happened in a way that was very formative, in other words, you had a lot of really adverse experiences happen to you, then you might still be in one of the earlier stages. That's not to say you're not an adult. That's not to say you're not a responsible human being. But a lot of people that suffer from trauma, a lot of people that are reactive, a lot of people that are rebellious, a lot of people that get angry easily, it's not their fault. But the fact is they're still in one of these earlier stages of development, and understanding where you're at can help you to know what you need to work on and help you to move into those later stages. And as you do the healing work, you'll naturally start experiencing and pushing through those experiences in those stages so that you can live the life as a functional adult that God meant for you to live. And if you're not living that life, it's not your fault. And you can overcome that and move into these later stages. So let's look at the stages of Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. And this is an article that's by Kendra Cherry, medically reviewed by David Sussman, PhD. And Erik Erikson was an ego psychologist who developed one of the most popular and influential theories of development. While his theory was impacted by psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud's work, I want to call him Sigmund Freud because I watched Bill and Ted too many times, but Sigmund Freud's work, Erikson's theory centered on psychosocial development rather than psychosexual development, which I'm not going to talk about that in this podcast because that's not really what I'm focused on here. So the stages of development are as follows. I'm going to go over them quickly because I don't want to get bogged down in this, but basically so you can understand them. You can look at the article, you can do more research so you can understand this more, but I want you to see how, if something adverse happened to you, if you had a high level of adverse childhood experiences, how that can leave you in one of these earlier stages of development, and how when you heal that, you will start to evolve into, you have to go through each of these stages now. You can't just skip them. But as you do inner child work, as you do somatic therapies, as you work with a therapist, as you allow God to heal you, and you get trauma at its root, and you understand where it came from, and you work with the body and the mind, you'll start to go through this natural evolution process of growing up inside, so to speak, of healing the inner child. And so basically the first step is infancy, birth to 18 months. And that's where you go through trust versus mistrust. It says the first stage of Erikson's theory occurs between birth and 1 year of age and is the most fundamental stage of life. So the damage could have happened before you even remembered it. It sucks. It's not fair. But you can reverse a lot of this with God's help and with the healing work. But it says, because an infant is utterly dependent, developing trust is based on dependability and quality of the child's caregivers. So if you had what you needed, food, love, warmth, safety, nurturing, that physical touch that is so vital to brain development in the first few stages of the first few months of life, then that can help the child to develop into a healthy individual and move to the next stage. So if they develop child trust, they will feel safe and secure in the world. Caregivers who are inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, or rejecting contribute to feelings of mistrust in the child under their care. Failure to develop trust will result in fear and a belief that the world is inconsistent and unpredictable. In other words, they don't go through that stage properly. Stage 2, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this is the second stage, and it occurs when a child is 2 to 3 years old. So this is when the child is a toddler. And this is also when a child tends to be potty trained. And that's when a child starts exploring the world. And if a child is encouraged and not given too much exposure too early, but also kept safe and encouraged to move out into the world at an age-appropriate level, then that child will develop independence and feel confident moving out into the world. It talks about potty training here a little bit too, but developing a sense of personal control over physical skills and a sense of independence. So children who struggle or who are shamed for their accidents may be left without a sense of personal control. Success during the stage of psychosocial development leads to feelings of autonomy, independence. Failure results in feelings of shame and doubt. And that's another stage one can get stuck in. It's almost like you can kind of go through these stages, but you don't go through them properly. So you have to go back and reparent yourself and let God reparent you so that you can go through these in a healthy way and you can be confident and feel safe and have independence in a healthy way. So stage three occurs in the age of 6 to 11. Stage three is preschool, 3 to 5 years old. Stage 3 is preschool, 3 to 5 years old, initiative versus guilt, and that's when you are exploring and finding a purpose, And the third stage of psychosocial development takes place during the preschool years. At this point, children begin to assert their power and control over the world through directing play and other social interactions. That's when kids start to interact with kids their own age and develop social skills. Children who are successful at this stage feel capable and able to lead others. Those who fail to acquire these skills, usually because they're not taught them or because they're not treated in a way that helps them to learn them or because they have adverse circumstances, they're left with a sense of guilt, self-doubt, and lack of initiative. So the major theme in this level is needing to begin to assert control and power over their environment. And success leads to a sense of purpose. And so children who try to exert too much power experience disapproval, resulting in a sense of guilt. So finding that balance, parenting is hard. That must be difficult, but it's that balance that helps the child to develop in that stage properly. The next stage is stage 4, and that's school age, 6 to 11 years old. School age, 6 to 11, and it's industry versus inferiority. And that's where they develop confidence, and that usually happens in school or in some kind of school setting. And like I said, there's a purpose to sharing all this, so follow me, okay? Because I'm going to bring all this together and show you how it affects you. But industry versus inferiority. At ages 5 or 6 to 11, through social interactions, children begin to develop a sense of pride in their accomplishments and abilities. That's why I talk about autonomy and agency in this podcast a lot. And I know that some Christians actually don't believe in those things, but I think they are absolutely necessary for a human being to have dignity and to have worth. You have to respect somebody's individual choices, even if you don't agree with them. And you have to be able to have that freedom yourself. And if you don't, it's very possible you're in an abusive relationship. But children need to cope with new social and academic demands. Success leads to a sense of competence, while failure leads to feelings of inferiority. So children who are encouraged and commended by parents and teachers develop a feeling of competence and belief in their skills. Those who receive little or no encouragement, or maybe even the opposite, from parents, teachers, or peers will doubt their abilities to be successful. Finding a balance at this stage leads to strength known as competence, but also confidence, in which children develop a belief in their abilities to handle the tasks set before them. That's stage 4. Stage 5, there are a total of, I believe, 8 stages here. Stage 5 is adolescence. That's 12 to 18. Adolescence, 12 to 18, and that's where you have identity versus role confusion. This is where a lot of children start to have confusion, experimentation, exploration, and questions about identity, about sexuality, about things like that. That's totally normal at that age. So adolescence, identity versus role confusion. And so the 5th stage is what you would call the turbulent teenage years. And I don't think any of us gets out of puberty and teen years without some experiences that are difficult. But it plays an essential role in developing a sense of personal identity, which will continue to influence behavior and development for the rest of a person's life. So it's a vital stage of life. Teens need to develop a sense of self and personal identity. Success leads to the ability to stay true to yourself, while failure leads to role confusion and a weak sense of self. And I'm not going to get into it too much detail, but I think we're seeing a crisis in our culture where teens are not being given a sense of identity, and they're reaching for it in some of the most unhealthy places. And I'm just going to leave it at that. That's always happened, but I think in the last 5 or 10 years, it's gotten really, really a crisis point in our culture. But during adolescence, children explore their independence and develop a sense of self. And identity, they develop their identity. What is identity? They are referring to all the beliefs, ideals, and values that help shape and guide a person's behavior. Completing this stage successfully leads to fidelity, which Erikson describes as the ability to live by society's standards and expectations. I would qualify that and say that you would live by your convictions, by what God wants you to do, and by, yes, society's expectations. Being a law-abiding citizen is biblical. The Bible talks about, being cooperative with the powers that be unless it contradicts your faith in some way. According to Erikson, our ego constantly changes due to new experiences and information, and we acquire it in our daily interaction with others. So identity is important. This is where teenagers develop what they want to do in their life, what they enjoy. They explore issues of religion and race and identity and sexuality and politics and all the complicated things that we deal with in our society today that are more complicated than ever. So that's a vital role. You can tell why somebody might get stuck in a stage there or not come out of that as healthy as they need to. And so, again, it can be worked on, and you can work on it even now, even if you're 40 or 50 or 60 years old. Stage 6. Stage 6 is young adulthood, 19 to 40. Intimacy versus isolation. So many people have been impacted by COVID, and I think that's affected the development of a lot of teenagers and young adults. But that's where relationships and love are really key, because between 19 and 40 is when most people get married, bond with a partner, go through serious intimate relationships. And so this stage, intimacy versus isolation, young adults need to form intimate, loving relationships with other people. And those aren't just marriages and emotional, romantic relationships. They're also friendships and colleagues and family and other types of relationships. Success leads to strong relationships, while failure results in loneliness and isolation. I think that's an oversimplification, but you get the idea. This stage covers the period of early adulthood when people are exploring personal relationships. Erikson believed it was vital that people develop close, committed relationships with other people. And I'm thinking that now more than ever. You need somebody in your life that you trust, that you love, that you feel safe with, and that validates you, and that you can do the same with them. Having a relationship with God can fill a lot of that void, and it's everything. But I still argue that you need relationships in your life with other human beings too, whether that's a family member or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a spouse or just a regular friend, colleagues, even a therapist relationship that's professional with professional boundaries can provide that for someone who may not have a lot of people in their life at the time. But engaging with other people in a support group, all of those are valid. Bible studies, church groups, but you need to find a place where you feel safe and validated and you can be yourself. Building on earlier stages, though, it says, each step, remember, it builds on the skills learned in the previous step. So having that strong sense of personal identity is what lays the foundation for good relationships. And you've probably observed that in your own life anyway. Successful resolution of this stage results in the virtue known as love. It is marked by the ability to form lasting, meaningful relationships. Stage 7 is generativity versus stagnation. Stage 7, generativity versus stagnation, and that is middle adulthood, 40 to 65 years of age, work and parenthood. The majority of that is in that stage of your life. That's when you're really in your work life and when you're raising, probably at that point, young adults, teenagers, and preteens, for the most part. So stage 7 talks about adults need to create and nurture things that will outlast them, often by having children or creating a positive change that benefits other people. I don't think that you have to have children to make a difference in this world, but it is one powerful, probably the most powerful way to do that. But there are other ways to do that as well. Like what I'm doing, I'm hoping it leaves a legacy for people and helps, maybe if you heal, you're able to pass that down to your children and so on. But success leads to feelings of usefulness and accomplishment, while failure results in shallow involvement in the world. During adulthood, we continue to build our lives, focusing on our career and family. Those who are successful during this phase will feel that they are contributing to the world by being active in their home and community. Those who fail to attain this skill will feel unproductive and uninvolved in the world. Care is the virtue achieved when this stage is handled successfully. Being proud of your accomplishments, watching your children grow into adults, and developing a sense of unity with your life partner, your spouse, are important accomplishments at this stage. Stage 8 is the last one. Stage 8, real quick, and that's maturity, and that's 65 years to death. So basically your senior years. Ego, integrity versus despair, reflection on life. Now, I will argue, I've seen people that are movers and shakers, accomplishing new things in their life, and maybe even for the first time in their life, they're healed and happy when they're at that age. And I'm not saying that you can't do that earlier, but some people may find that later in life. So I don't believe you're just looking back at your life and either, there's nothing you can do about it. You can still do all kinds of things with your life at that age if you're able to. Until you breathe your last breath, it's not too late. But it does say the final stage occurs during old age and is focused on reflecting back on life. At this point in development, people look back on events of their lives and determine if they are happy with the life they lived or if they regret the things they did and didn't do. I would argue that's still something you can do something about at that age. But this is a stage where this happens too. His theory differed from many others because it addressed development throughout the entire lifespan, including old age. I agree with Erikson. That's just my opinion. Older adults need to look back on life and feel a sense of fulfillment. Success at this stage leads to feelings of wisdom, while failure results in regret, bitterness, and despair. At this stage, people reflect back on events of their lives and take stock. Those who look back on the life they feel well lived will feel satisfied and ready to face the end of their lives with a sense of peace. Those who look back only feeling regret will instead feel fearful that their lives will end without accomplishing the things they feel they should have. Wow, that's powerful. And there's a book called The 5 Regrets of the Dying. The 5 Regrets of the Dying. I forgot the author's name, but I'll put it in the show notes. And that book is powerful because she worked with terminally ill patients over years and created a book where there were the same things over and over that people said that they regretted. I cannot recommend that book enough because that really helps you think about this stage. You can prepare for stages you haven't even gotten to yet, right? So the outcome here is those who feel proud of their accomplishments will feel a sense of integrity. Successfully completing this phase means looking back with few regrets and a general feeling of satisfaction. So, there is criticism of Erikson's work and support of it, but that just gives you an idea of the stages we go through in life as we develop psychologically and what it looks like if you developed healthfully and if you didn't develop healthfully. So, what has this got to do with an adverse childhood? Everything. There's another article called ACEs Too High. It's called 7 Ways Childhood Adversity Changes a Child's Brain. And I'm not going to talk so much about the brain, except that when you look at Erikson's stages of development, and then you consider adverse childhood experiences, that's what ACE is. There's actually a very widely accepted test you can take. And you can Google this, you can look it up, you can watch YouTube videos, you can read articles. This article here talks about how adverse childhood experiences. There are different levels of that. If you have a low one, you're going to have less of these. If you have a middle one, you're going to have a little bit of these. If you have a high one, you're going to have more. If you have really high, you're going to have major issues. But it can affect how that development occurs. So if you had things that happened to you when you were an infant, if you had things that happened to you when you were a toddler, or you were in elementary or middle or high school, or even a young adult, that can actually change your brain. So I want you to go and take the ACEs test, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and see where you land on that. And I would maybe take a couple of them if there's different ones. Don't make that the be all end all. Don't, take it with a grain of salt, but it can be interesting and insightful. And see if you can start making connections between specific adverse childhood experiences that happen in certain phases of your life, and where that might have affected your development emotionally, psychologically, even physically. Because it says in the article that adverse childhood experiences, what are adverse childhood experiences, first of all? That's a good question, but it can be anywhere from traumatic experiences that happen, like the death of a loved one. It can be abuse. It can be moving around a lot. It could be having a parent who had cancer or had psychological problems or was an alcoholic. It could be childhood emotional neglect. It could be any number of things, health problems that you had or a sibling had. But those things can add up if there's a lot of them, or one or two that are extremely impactful, that creates trauma and actually affects the development of our brain and affects our psychological development, which means you can get stuck in one of those not fully resolved stages of Erikson's stages. Do you see how you can combine those? And so read about what adverse childhood experiences are, and read about what different types there are, and maybe start doing some journaling about different stages of your life. You might even journal a little bit about each of the 8 stages using one of these articles about Erikson's 8 stages of development. The point of this is to show you that childhood, everybody knows that childhood forms the kind of person that you are. But I wanted you to see that they're starting to see research now that if you got stuck in one of these stages of development, you can actually do the healing work and evolve and grow emotionally and mentally beyond that, and become mentally what you should be at that age, if that makes sense. And so doing that healing work can really help you. Taking that test, writing the journals out. It could take weeks of doing this, but it can give you so much insight. I've done some of this in the past, and it helped me learn so much about myself. So you might look at Erikson's 8 stages of development. Take the ACEs childhood test, and then start going through each of those stages and write a journal about what your childhood was like, what major life events happened. You might even create a map or a timeline. I've done those before in some programs I've done. And start just getting insights about how your childhood impacted who you are, where traumas might be stuck in the body. And if you have those, bookmark those and note those. And then come back to them and do more journaling on them. Do meditations on them. Do childhood emotional healing on them. Do some inner child work on them even. But when you have an adverse childhood, it can affect your actual physiology. It can affect the size and shape of your brain. It can affect your ability to learn and how your neural network develops. It can affect what are called telomeres, which is basically the ability to cope with certain things. Those are DNA strands. It can affect your default network mode, which is part of your brain. And it can also affect the brain-body pathway and brain connectivity. That's pretty serious stuff. But what they're finding is that you can actually reverse a lot of that. You can actually make those new neural connections in your brain. You can actually go back and heal a lot of that stuff. So do that work. Learn about your childhood. Write about your stages of development. Take the ACEs test and learn about yourself. The more you know about yourself and the more you can target, where do I need to heal? And then what exercises and what work can I do to work on this? Journaling and somatic therapy and meditation and prayers and scriptures, and target scriptures towards areas where you're struggling, knowing that. And you will start taking yourself through those stages of development. You will start to rewire your brain. You will start to reprogram your brain so that you get through those stages and so that those pathways are reconnected in your body and in your mind. Science has shown through neuroplasticity that that's possible. And another one that I had talked about is that if you see a therapist, there's something called IFS. It's Internal Family Systems. And I actually have a therapist that I work with who is wonderful. And he works with me on IFS. And it's basically where you have a self. And the self is that part of you that hasn't been touched by any of it. It's the part of you that observes things that are going on. It's the part of you that's calm, that's nurturing, that's balanced. And then you have these parts that are reactive. And these parts can be different ages. They can be 2 years old, 10 years old, 15, 30. But they're the parts of you that are still in you that sometimes are unresolved. And they're the ones that tend to be reactive, protective, fearful, angry. And by working with these different parts, you're doing childhood work and inner child work to work on those parts in these different stages of development. You might work a little bit on your toddler self and then come over here and work on your teenage self and then come back over here and work on your 6 to 11-year-old self. It doesn't have to all be chronological, but when you're working on it, you'll start to see that difference over time. So looking into IFS might be something if you can find a good therapist that does it, or even just learning about it and doing some of it on your own. So those are some suggestions about how you can take Erikson's stages of development and use it to help you to understand your childhood and adverse childhood experiences. Take the ACEs test and then start doing journaling on those different stages of development. Do the inner child work, the meditations, and all of that. And start using that to help you heal trauma at its source in another way. So I just wanted to share this with you to educate you and help empower you to learn a little bit more about where maybe some of this trauma came from, if it's rooted in childhood, and just to understand it a little more. I know this was a long video, but thank you so much for following me. Thank you for listening. Check out the other YouTube videos, hit the subscribe button, check out my Facebook page, Christian Emotional Recovery. Check out the podcast, Christian Emotional Recovery, and check out the Patreon, where you can help support what I'm doing and help me to be able to do more of it and help more trauma survivors and abuse survivors like yourself. Thank you so much for listening and following me in this video. God bless you. Remember, you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God loves you. Thank you so much for going on this journey with me today, for listening to this YouTube channel that has been converted to a podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little bit about the different stages of development, first of all. Second of all, what adverse childhood experiences are. And third of all, how adverse childhood experiences of different kinds, whether it's abuse, neglect, other experiences as well, how those can impact your development. And while this isn't a be-all, end-all, it does help you to begin to understand how you might get stuck in different phases of development in different areas of your life. Does that mean that you're 12 years old mentally in every way? No, it doesn't mean that. But emotionally, in specific areas of your life, there is an inner 12-year-old that needs to be healed and loved and talked to, and needs to go back through that trauma so that she or he can heal. And that's exactly what this video was all about. Once again, if you haven't, check out the YouTube channel where you can get more exclusive content like this video/podcast. And also click on the bell to subscribe. The link is below, the YouTube link in the show notes. And also check out the Facebook group, Christian Emotional Recovery, and join. And also check out the webpage, which is ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Have a great day. God bless you. Remember, you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God loves you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.